Welcome to the latest edition of STRI's podcast. Today we're going to be talking about integrated turf management. So that's been a hot topic over the past few years. We want to talk a little bit about some of the work and some of the challenges that potentially are on the horizon and some of the things that have gone on, perhaps in a more legislative space over the past 12 months. But it's a great pleasure to say that we're joined by some guests today. So we have Glenn Kirby from Syngenta, and we have Dr. Andy Owen from ICL. So, guys, do you want to introduce yourselves? Let's start off with Glenn, first of all.
Hi, Christian. Yeah, Glenn Kirby, technical manager for Syngenta across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And I guess my role, I don't think I've ever explained it to the public what I actually do. I think my role is once the registration work is done for products, then it becomes my responsibility to work out how it's going to fit into the market. So there's a subtle difference. I see all the registration stuff going on, Christian, but my job is to kind of position it in the market and then support it when it's there. So yeah, that's me. That's what I do.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Glenn. Andy, do you want to talk about what your role is at ICL?
Yeah, thanks, Christian. So my official role is the International Technical Manager for ICL. I guess I spend my time communicating our range of products out to our sales teams, our dealer distributors and our customers. Also spend a fair bit of time on research, running independent and internal trials on our products, and really generally thinking about how we can be responsible with what we've got and how we can, advise best practice on their use, I think.
Brilliant. And thanks very much for that. And there no two better guests, I think, for this type of topic today to talk about it. ITM, what it means, why are we worried about it? Why should we be thinking about ITM and best practice? What's the current state of play in terms of knowledge, but also what might be coming down the road and some of the challenges we need to address as well. So to start off with, a bit of a warm-up question for you both, really. We'll start off with Andy this time. What does ITM mean to you? What does ITM mean to you personally or ICL?
Yeah, I guess it's not a new concept. When I started teaching probably 20 years ago, we were talking about designing the best programs you can for your site, making best use of products that are available and technologies that you might be able to use. And really, I see ITM as being just that, being proactive and preventative rather than responsive to what's going on, and trying to make use of everything that's out there in the best way, being well educated, being well informed, understanding your site and putting together a program that gives you the best turf possible, I suppose.
And so that's a really good point about the sort of ITM isn't new. And I think when I had a little look, although we perhaps didn't call it ITM back in the day, it was Integrated Pest Management. Yeah, I think the first ever article that's out there in the press from the sort of turf side was from 1979, and it more or less said, Integrated Pest Management, we've been doing this for years, for some decades already. This isn't new, it's just got a new shiny name. And I think that's the key, isn't it? That it is at the heart of it, it is good, solid greenkeeping or turf management. I think that's a really the crux of it. And so, Glenn, what do you feel, because you've coming from a background of obviously working currently in Syngenta, technical sort of manager and products and how they get used best for a particular situation, but you've also coming from a greenkeeping course management background. So how important do you feel ITM and thinking in an ITM way is for greenkeepers and groundspeople?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you make there, Christian, because I actually think there was a lot of integrated management going on in the early days of greenkeeping that we probably regressed out of into non-integrated solutions, and now we're just regressing back into it. So it's just a full circle, really. And I think a perfect example of that is, something like the leather jacket management challenge we've had, where our one solution became chlorpyrifos. And then everything else in our program just ignored leather jackets. And what we've had to do is we've lost that since 2016 is think about how we integrate this back together. So we're now thinking about nutrition, and I know ICL are doing a lot of work there to make sure we're in the right position to deal with any issues. We're thinking about timings much better. We're thinking about identification of the insect much better. We're thinking about good application of low impact chemistry. We're thinking about how we integrate with biologicals. So connecting all of these dots is how we make truly integrated solutions. And it's important from another point of view as well, because in hindsight, we should have looked at that chlorpyrifos situation with leather jackets and thought, our whole program is solely reliant on one tool. That is a really dangerous place to be. So integrated solutions are all about leaning on lots of different strategies, all having impacts, some of them marginal gains, some of them big gains. But when you connect them all up together, it puts you in a better position rather than relying on one sole piece of chemistry. Now, greenkeepers are pretty good in some areas with this, not so good in other areas. And I think it's so important because we don't want to be caught in a position where if that one tool disappears, we're in trouble. We never want to be in that position again. So we need to look at lots of solutions to make sure we're being as responsible as we can, but that makes it more complex and more challenging because we've got to understand these things. We've got to invest the time. We've got to educate ourselves. We as industry have got to come up with a number of different solutions to things rather than just one. So it's connecting this whole thing to make sure we're using the resources responsibly, but we're also not putting ourselves in a position where if we lose it, we're in trouble.
Absolutely. And I think that's tremendously important. And I think the point you raised about it is a jigsaw. There are a huge number of pieces that we have to pull together in terms of not only our understanding of fundamentally a root cause why a potential problem could be coming about, but also how do we layer together those different management approaches, whether they are physical or cultural, whether it's thinking about grass species and getting the best species into our turf or the best variety or cultivar into our turf, overlaid with the plant health and the stress and the growing environment and all of these things together with sustainable use of an effective use of plant protection products to resolve and preventatively tackle problems. I think that's really important. And for me, it's always been that ITM is best practice, and best practice is acting in a responsible way and a proactive way when it comes to managing turf for the betterment of both the turf, because typically when you start addressing one problem, you're also having benefits around the fringes, but also it's having that environmental footprint benefit and hopefully ultimately as well brings that improvement in resilience in turf. In terms of ITM, we are on best practice approaches. There are a number of pressures which are external to the industry, and they're having an impact on how we manage turf. We'll touch a little bit on the legislation and stuff shortly, but for me, there are other pressures as well, such as climate change, financial pressures, resource, businesses and business viability. How do you think ITM, and this is a question for let's start off with Andy here, how do you think ITM fits in that kind of world where we have all these different points of attack of pressure on a turf manager thinking about a golf course or a football pitch?
Yeah, it is an interesting one. I suppose, ultimately the turf manager is trying to produce the best surface he can for his situation. And, if he can do that effectively and efficiently, it is going to help in all those areas. It's going to help mitigate some of the extent of climate change, maybe not all, but it's going to help the business of the golf club by presenting better surfaces or the best possible surfaces for people to play. And integrated turf management shouldn't necessarily be more expensive or a more expensive approach, although, you can imagine there are some parts of that where if you're making multiple applications rather than single applications, there could be a cost implication. But it shouldn't be necessarily about doing lots more. It should be just about doing certain things in the right way, I think. And there's an obligation on the industry, I think, to provide best practice advice to be clear in how we use products and to guide people in terms of the use of trial work that I know we all do, so that people can get a better understanding and produce better surfaces.
And so from your point of view, Glenn, both sitting on both sides of the fence, course management, as well as now very much driving change in the industry, how do you see ITM responding to some of those pressure changes? Are there any particular pressures that you feel are going to be, well, either here now or coming up in the short to medium term that we really need to get to tackle?
Yeah, I think this is a changing picture, Christian. I think if we look down the line at climate change, we're getting much better at starting to model to have disease pressure and to have stress pressures, so we can make some pretty rudimental predictions on what things look like in 5 years and 10 years time. And particularly something like dollar spot, we really do turn a corner in the next 5 to 10 years time, and it's not something we've had to deal with here before. It's not something that places have had to deal with without chemistry in their armory. So there's some real challenges over that horizon, and we've got to start doing the work now to understand how we integrate these things. Nutrition particularly, I think, is going to have a big role with that one. I think cultural practices are. I think we've already got fungicide solutions to deal with it, but the reality is we don't probably think that's the most responsible way of dealing with things. They will have a role to play there, but we need to lower the pressure on those challenges in the future using cultural nutrition, and then finally taking out the real high pressure periods using fungicides in order to deliver what we need to do. But they're the kind of things that are coming down coming down the line now. And in order to get a grips with those, we've got to do the work now in order to be prepared for when it actually arrives with us. So, I know Andy's done some great work in the Golf Course 2030 study recently, looking at the nutrition impact on that. We're doing a lot of work in modelling, digital modelling, to try and improve people's position and their ability to make preventative applications and understand the pressure. And it's those combinations. Integrated, I think, used to just be aeration and a bit of iron and a bit of this. And actually, integration of the future is really good nutrition, really good modelling, a biological solution, and a fungicide solution, because the pressures of the future are much greater than the ones we've seen historically, because the golfer is not letting go of those expectations.
And I think that's absolutely right. And what happens, ITM, some of the biggest challenges we face when it comes to pest, weed and diseases often come from disease and disease management. And one of the things with climate change is unpredictability, but also potentially extending that window over which the fungi is going to be in the ascendancy in terms of the potential pressure season. So being much more on it in terms of understanding what's going on, understanding when your key pressure points are, understanding why you have that problem in the first place, what fundamentally isn't quite in balance, that is swinging things in the favour of the plant pathogen and not in the grass, whether that's in the soil environment or within the plant canopy or the plant itself. So I think there's some real challenges to get our head around. And Andy, you touched on education. I know from your past experience, you worked in education. Just how vital do you think education and information, and do you think we've got it right, or are there more things that we could or should be doing in that world, talking about best practice and ITM?
I think we can always do a little bit more, and we can always push best practice and ITM and responsible turf management. I think the future, as Glenn's already said, is in improving how we model what's going on our turf, how we provide data for our sites that allows us to understand it a little bit better, and to sit back and reflect on the practices that we do and how we can improve them year on year. We also have to be clear that we have to manage expectations, and if we're seeing increased disease pressure or disease pressure for longer periods or in different times of the year, there will be times when we can't necessarily present 100% clean turf, and we have to try and manage those expectations as well. And I see that as part of of integrated turf management. And, course managers have got to improve their ability to communicate with their customers and with their players. Some of them do really well. Some of them, I think, could improve that area as well. And so it's encompassing all these aspects, isn't it, to provide the best service they can.
And knowledge, the old adage, knowledge is power in this circumstance, best practice ITM. But having to become a lot more technical, as Ben said, it's not just going out and banging some holes in something and improving drainage. That's a part of it. We have to be a lot cuter and smarter with understanding the world around us and how it all fits together. And talking about the world around us, there's been a few rumblings in the European context over the past, more than 12 months now. And hopefully everyone in the industry is aware, perhaps UK and European-wide, of what's been bubbling away in the sort of legislative world with the proposed sustainable use regulation from Europe, which would have seen, if it had actually been enacted at the European Parliament, quite significant changes to what would be in our toolkit when it came to managing pests, weeds and diseases. Now that pressure has subsided a little bit with that piece of legislation not passing. But how important, Glenn, this is probably a good one for you to start off on, how important do you feel legislation is in terms of driving ITM and how we manage turf now and also going into the future?
I think it's critical, and the pressure hasn't gone away. If I look across my region, so I think I manage 26 countries. What it means, the legislation changes and regulatory framework means that every country is doing their own thing. So I've got all extremes across my area. I've got places like Netherlands where there's nothing available. I've got places like France where we've got a changing regulatory framework very quickly. And we've got places like the UK, which are in a much better position. Everyone across Europe is trying to reduce their pesticide uses by 50%. They're just doing it in different ways. So, I think legislation is really important. I think we've seen some really responsible usage coming out. I think some countries are being a lot tougher than others, but we can learn from what's going on there. I think some other countries are doing less. What's fascinating across Europe at the moment is to see how everyone is set up differently and everyone's dealing with it differently. And that means we're learning different things in different places. Now, I have to put the positive spin on that, because other than that, it makes my day job an absolute nightmare, but no one really cares about that. So I think we're learning things all over the place at the moment, but what we have to recognise is every country, every setup has a different set of pressures and climatic challenges and golfer challenges. So from a regulatory point of view, it's critical, it's important, it's moving us into a much more responsible usage, which I'm really happy about. It also means that we've got to invest in areas to make sure that the future looks much better, which we are doing, which is really good news. And we've got to do the research and the investment to understand how they all piece together. The danger is with regulation is that it happens too quickly and we don't get the time to adjust, and then it's panic mode. And once we move into that situation, people don't know what to do. As long as we can adjust with time, invest in the R&D, then I think things will be difficult, but fine. I was very concerned about the recent changes that were proposed because they were quite dramatic and they were quite fast, and I was concerned that we wouldn't get the time to adjust out of it. But knowing it's been pushed back a little bit, it will get reviewed. I think we've got the room there to do the work to move us all into a better place.
And then just for those listeners that weren't quite aware of the sustainable use regulation and potentially the big changes that it was going to bring in the European context, was in reality, as amenity in the kind of amenity services we'll be dealing with, would be limited to low-risk products, none of which have been put forward for turf management issues, or biologicals, which is quite a significant change in our armoury. And so that would have had undoubtedly an impact. And as you said, Glenn, that change could have happened really quickly. And I think one of the things I've taken out of everything I've done in turf over these years is you were dealing with a natural ecosystem, and they naturally have a change period in lag time. So just like me, if I'm going to get up and start, going to go run the London Marathon this year, I'm going to be in trouble. Give me 2 years to train intensively, I might just make it. So it's about conditioning, creating the conditions for success to allow that to happen. So I think that's really important. And I think that timing and time phrase and how the reduction happens is really important when it comes to that. And Andy, do you have any thoughts about what happened over the sort of the course of the last 12 months about sustainable use regulations? And do you also see the opportunities that arise from that legislative driver?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, it was concerning, as Glenn said, the speed at which they were thinking of moving. And I saw a lot of worried faces in various meetings and events that I was attending. I think it has, allowed us to think long and hard about, how we do approach things in the future, which is good. Hopefully, to set up and do some good research that helps people and gives the best advice in how to use the products and to think about the right way to do it. I think there's real will to reduce inputs in terms of pesticides moving forward, and that's got to be a good thing. But it's all about responsible use, isn't it, and making the best use of what's available. And so it will be interesting, to see whether that does come back as a legislation or not, or whether we'll move forward with individual countries doing their own thing, and we'll just take a view on that, I think, when it happens.
And I think within STRI, we were working with a number of sporting bodies, with the European Golf Association and UEFA on an impact assessment, looking at what that might have, what might be the impacts for sport. And one of the things talking with the European Commission was data is king, and that's something that really jumped out at me while trying to put that together. Is there's lots of good stuff, there's lots of good examples in Europe, looking at countries like Denmark and Netherlands and France about tackling meaningful reduction, trying to have a much more sustainable approach to plant protection products with best practice ITM. But one of the things that really jumped out was really the lack of data, the lack of evidence in a quantitative form that allows us to talk about what we do now and how much benefit we're having. And talking with the policymakers, with the European Commission, that's a major issue that I think as an industry, in terms of policymakers, regulators, individual sporting bodies, how we collect that data and the standardization of that to demonstrate what we're doing is going to be really important. And so that's something, a bit of a banner for me at the minute, is to say, we've got to work out how we're going to collect this data to show what we do and to be able to demonstrate the good work that we are doing, because that's going to be vital for tackling what will come round again. There will be more legislation which comes to looking at reducing the use of plant protection products. So we need to be ready for that and get ourselves match fit ready for that.
Absolutely.
Leading on to what do you think as an industry? Let's start off with Glenn with this one. Where do we think as an industry the opportunities or the issues we're going to tackle, or perhaps some responses we need to put together to make sure that when that day comes, as we are moving towards that, and the legislative pressure or the legislative driver actually comes into force, how could we get ourselves match fit?
Okay, well, I think we all have a responsibility to play here. I think if we look at mine and Andy's end of the scale, we are committing and have to continue to commit to proper R&D and understanding how we piece all these bits of the jigsaw together for all the potential scenarios to make sure we're offering really good advice. Out in the field, on the ground, we've got to be thinking really hard about what we're doing now, and is it responsible, and are we doing it to the best of our abilities? Because, it's all very well talking about regulations and reducing of plant protection products, but we've got to start looking at what we're using now in the field, and are we using it properly? Are we applying it at the right time? Are we applying it preventatively rather than curatively and getting the best out of it? Are we setting our sprayers up correctly? Are our wash bays set up to make sure that we're not getting any washout into areas where we don't want it? All of those things are critical. Now, we've also got to think about that data collection element of it, Christian. I do remember going back maybe 3 or 4 years when I was a youngling at Syngenta and talking about Accelebrin and talking about collecting data about how if Accelebrin isn't giving us the levels of control we want and need, then we need to present some data back to industry about how we're doing the best we can with what we've got and present data going forward. Now, that was really well received. It was a message that was very, very emotive at the time. There were lots of people really struggling. Yet even on the back of that, industry hasn't pulled itself together to start gathering data on these kind of things. The most we've got is maybe some application sheets to show when we've applied things, to show we've been working towards better timings. I think the question for me is, how does industry do it? Because I don't think as individuals gathering that pool of data is going to happen, because as much as greenkeepers and course managers talk to each other, they're an unwieldy bunch. This is like herding cats. They're all over the place. They've all got their ideas, their own systems, their own ways of doing it, which is brilliant. And I love greenkeeping for that because it's so innovative. But we've got no overriding body pulling that data together on a regular basis. So data gathering as an industry, I think, is going to be critical to explaining our challenges. I'm not convinced I know where that data gathering exercise comes from at the moment. There's a lot of good course managers gathering their own data, and they can use it for improving their own conditioning and maybe fine-tuning their own ITM programs. But this large-scale data gathering project, which is getting ourselves match fit for the next conversation, I'm not sure I see where that's coming from.
And that for me as well is sort of echoes with me, and really that's then engaging with a conversation with key stakeholders, with policymakers, with regulators, with national governments. And this is a pan-European thing. How do we actually go about this? And I think that's really important. Andy, what are your thoughts on that kind of data analytics and next steps forward, really, with all of that?
Yeah, no, I would agree with what Glenn said. In the first instance, there are already lots of things that course managers can measure, and many are doing a good job of that, but it is quite local and individual to the site. You know, we have seen, if we look back over the last 10 or 20 years, just, you know, measuring organic matter, measuring surface performance, measuring moisture, you know, all these things can help turf managers to produce a better surface and understand their site better and put good programs in place. And, you know, there is a need for organizations to think about that more fully and to pull it together and make some sense of the data in total. You know, looking forward, I think there's more we can do with disease modelling and turf modelling, things like that. I think we can improve that, site-specific modelling as well. I'm quite interested in. That's got to be useful. And, you know, you could be optimistic about a few things. I'm sure someone will crack maybe species identification, you know, automated species identification on the surface, which would, you know, in a small way, help many greenkeepers with managing their surface, transitioning species over, which could be an important part of ITM in the future, you know, just helping with overseeding, being more efficient about the resources that they use. That's a really important product to think about, or piece of research that needs to be done. I'm sure in fact, I'm almost certain someone will come up with a good way of doing that over the next few years. You know, and that'll make things interesting. So there's lots we can be thinking about and doing, and we need to continue the efforts.
And I think that's absolutely true. And I think for me, to sort of sum up really ITM, is that we are doing a huge amount of good stuff. Is there more work to do? Absolutely. Is there more we could all do in talking about it, communicating it, educating at every level, from new boys and girls coming into industry to, like me, some of the older lags that might be a little harder to get that message to sink home. We really have to not hide in a trench, keeping undercover, thinking this thing will pass us by. Yeah. We really need to engage, and the most successful countries in terms of moving forward with this agenda have been those that have actively engaged with regulators, with the regulatory environment, and try to bring together their industries to come up with concerted efforts. And ITM is a very personal thing. Managing a golf course, managing a football pitch is a very site-specific thing. is taking those bits of the jigsaw and putting them together, but helping people understand how those bits in the jigsaw may fit together for them, and what sustainable looks for them in terms of their surfaces, how they manage them, the inputs. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. There are some challenges, but there are some real opportunities. So I want to give you guys a little last chance to any concluding thoughts on ITM, any messages that you'd like to get out to whoever in the industry, policymakers, turf managers, about ITM and where you see ITM going, and what anything we should be really working towards over these coming next few years. So let's start off with Andy on that.
Yeah, I think we've covered all the key bits there, really. I'd like people to continue to make the most of the education that's available, the understanding from the research trials that certain companies and yourselves do, think about what they do, and to continue to be progressive with their management, really. Think about being preventative rather than responsive. Think about how they can measure more things to allow them to get more information to do things better, and that's generally the story we want to push.
Perfect. And Glenn, last words to you?
Yeah, a couple of bits. One, this is entirely possible. We shouldn't be afraid of it. If we look at what we've done over the span of my career, the last 25 years, not down to me by any means, but down to everyone else, with micronokium patch. I think back to the mid-90s when I started greenkeeping, and all the tools in our armoury then, we were dealing with plate-sized chunks of micronokium in the middle of greens at very high-end golf courses. If I look at what people are dealing with now and the surfaces they're providing to their customers, they are phenomenal. They're using less fungicides than we did in the 90s. They're producing much better surfaces year-round in more difficult conditions, because we're seeing much more mild conditions. And that's due to looking at, the great work that Mark Hunt did, looking at nutrition, the stuff that Henry and Andy have picked up with their wetting agent work and their nutrition work. And we now have fully integrated solutions combining all of those technologies for micronokium that has developed since the 90s. We're using less chemistry. I know that because I get to see the numbers behind the scenes. We are using a wider range of technologies to deal with that, and we are coming up with significantly better surfaces. So course managers out there at the moment, very, very few of you are presenting surfaces that are disappointing to customers in the winter. They are usually amazing. Even when people call me in because they've got a problem, honestly, the surfaces are fantastic that we're producing now. So there's that going on. From a legislation point of view, when they start thinking about how that's going to look, I would ask for more stewardship. I would ask for more responsible usage. I would ask for more justification of why we need to apply. If we think back to the chlorpyrifos days that we mentioned earlier, how many applications of that got made without it being necessary? An awful lot, I would suggest now, looking back at it. Can we start justifying why we're applying these things rather than blanket bans, which don't work because you've got so many different pressure climates all over the place and so many different disease challenges and pest challenges? We need to start justifying and understanding why we're doing it, putting that into modelling. Now, Andy mentioned modelling briefly for diseases and for pests, and I think that's going to be a big part of the future. Now, I don't think it's course managers' roles to be developing those models. I think it's their roles to be adopting them once companies like us or ICL or STRI or research centres come up with those models and start using them, and then be realistic about what to expect from them. None of those models at the moment are going to solve their problems overnight. This is a long-term journey about understanding what their site looks against the modelling, so year on year we can tweak, improve, get better and better and better. But industry has to start adopting the data that's being put in front of them, looking at it, starting to relate it to their site, understanding it and using it to improve their timing. So I think there's things there the customer can do. I think there's things that I'd like to see happen from a stewardship point of view. But also I do think it is all well within reach if we get our heads together, because we've done it already with several things.
Absolutely right. And I think that's a very positive message to end on, Glenn. All of this is possible. We just need to make sure that we get everything right that we can do, that we make sure we put all those bits in the jigsaw in the right place, and then we end up with a big picture, and we end up with more sustainable, better quality or the best possible quality surfaces for those conditions, and ultimately better environmental, financial and socially stable sporting facilities, which are for the benefit of everybody. So that's been a tremendous gala through integrated turf management, and I thank you both for joining me today. It's been fabulous to have you on the podcast, and I've enjoyed that tremendously and look forward to speaking to you again in the future. So thank you very much, Glenn and Andy. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing.